Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me from the Singapore Fintech Festival, we have Thilan Wickramasinghe. He's the head of research over at Maybank Securities. We're going to discuss democratizing ESG investing. Thilan, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks.
Great to be here.
How is Southeast Asia positioned in terms of ESG, especially when you think about market access for retail investors?
Absolutely. I think it's very, very nascent at this stage. I mean, even if you leave the retail alone for a minute and you look at the institutional side, only 1.5% of ESG fund flows actually arrive in ASEAN. And if you look at the debt markets, only around 1.7% of green and sustainability linked bonds actually originated from ASEAN versus around a quarter of it actually which gets done in Asia Pacific. So it's very, very early stages, and there's quite a lot of access gaps in terms of things like green bonds for retail investors. There's very few green ETFs, green model portfolios are very few and far between. So there's a lot of gaps currently in ASEAN at this stage.
What are some of the trends that you're seeing in the sustainability space?
I think we need to start with the negatives, right? I mean, if you look at the latest UN data, by 2030, global emissions will only be about 3% lower than 2019 levels. It needs to be 30% lower if we have any hope of getting below the 2 degrees Celsius mark that we need to be in. That was agreed in Paris. And if you look at the regions in the world, the G7, the G20 and ASEAN are very behind in terms of overall targets. But this also gives us a very significant opportunity. If you look at ASEAN and if you look at the businesses here, a lot of them are very old world. So manufacturing, utilities, plantations, these are very high emission businesses which will need to transition very quickly to low emission and low carbon. Now, in order to do that, it's going to be a very complex process compared to a lot of the industrialized countries. It's going to be a lot more expensive, and that's because this is a developing region still in the world, right? So that means that the transition will have to be very, very just in order to protect jobs and growth while at the same time reduce decarbonization. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and it's also happening at a time where you're having one of the biggest wealth transfers in history in Asia. Around $15 trillion are moving from the baby boomers and the Gen Xers to the millennials as well as the Gen Zs. And one of the things that we've seen, looking at our own customer profile as well, the millennials and the Gen Zs, they tend to be a lot more purpose-driven in the way they invest. And they want to align not just returns but also their values when they're looking at investments. So I think that's also going to be very, very positive. Plus, I think finally is if you look at the regulators and the exchanges in the region, they are driving a lot more towards transparency and disclosure, particularly in terms of ESG.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're seeing that in the States, and I would argue globally that younger investors really do invest with purpose and to align their values. So what is Maybank doing specifically to foster ESG accessibility for retail investors?
Yeah, so we are addressing it from the supply side as well as from the demand side. What I mean by the supply side is we are building our own internal capabilities, and that's the journey. I think, for example, we are building the capabilities of our analysts and our bankers to build ESG into how they look at deals, how they look at investment opportunities, how they value a company or how they look at risk. So that's being done on the one hand. And on the other hand, there is this massive knowledge gap, particularly when it comes to the retail investor, as to what's ESG, why is it important, how do you actually generate alpha from ESG? So from that side, that is where the demand side comes in, where we are trying to overcome the first roadblock, which is the knowledge gaps, and there we are trying to educate. And largely we are running a lot of webinars, a lot of seminars in order to get retail investors particularly interested and understand why ESG is important, and then how to make money out of it. Right? That's the ultimate goal for investors. And at the same time, we are also looking at new products as well, so things like green portfolios, as well as more accessibility to things like green ETFs and so on.
All right, Thilan, appreciate the insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me from the Singapore Fintech Festival. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.